Welcome to At Issue. I'm your host, Steve Stavro. This week, we're going to be discussing the Vatican's role in the New World Order. Joining us is Bill Hughes, and thank you for being with us, Bill. Bill's an author, researcher, and pastor of the church here in Umatilla, Florida. I hope I said that right. Umatilla, Florida.
You got it, Steve.
Okay. And if you would, Bill, let's just launch into this discussion with what do you think the Vatican's role is in the New World Order?
Steve, I think ultimately they control every aspect of the New World Order, from the political leaders, the financial gurus of our world today, and also the churches of today. I think that's the clear picture that we have, and all the research that I have done, Steve, pinpoints the domination of the Vatican in the world affairs of today. It's very secretive, Steve, in their involvement in all of these things, because they look like they're so good and trying to promote peace and trying to promote harmony throughout the world. But in actuality, they're the ones that are pulling the strings behind the scenes. And again, in the political, religious, and economic realms of this world.
Okay. And for those who are not familiar with the workings of the Vatican, maybe we should just touch on who controls the Vatican. When we say that word, what the Vatican means, the papacy, of course, but maybe who is controlling the papacy, and who do you see as wielding the power behind the throne, as to say it in a certain way?
Well, in a spiritual context, Steve, Vatican means the divining serpent, and the serpent throughout history, whether it be biblical history, whether it be secular history, as far back as the Garden of Eden, the serpent, of course, was the medium through which the devil sought to destroy our first parents, Adam and Eve. So ultimately, the devil is behind the Vatican. Now, when you look at in a human point of view, it's clear from history that the Jesuit order, which is the military arm of the Catholic Church, that they control the white pope, the one who we all see out in front. At this point, of course, it's Pope Benedict XVI. But ultimately, the one behind the white pope is the black pope, the Jesuit general.
And when you say the military arm of the Vatican, I think it's important that we say you're not speaking hyperbole, you're speaking literally. They have a history of being assassins. If we could touch on just a few things in their history, maybe that's the way to approach this. Let's go back to 1517, Martin Luther's come on the scene, and the whole Protestant Reformation has begun.
When you look at history, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the door at Wittenberg in 1517. And from there, of course, he stood before the Diet of Worms and Charles V in 1521. The Reformation spread like wildfire because people for centuries had listened to tradition and had listened to lies and myths and foolishness. And so when Luther came in with his two great themes, one of sola fide, by faith alone, and the other sola scriptura, the Bible and the Bible only, Steve, these sent a shockwave throughout Europe. And the Vatican, that had stood so strong and so powerful for so long, they were shaken at their very foundations. And so you come up to the diets that were held. Of course, the Diet of Worms in 1521, the Diet of Spires in 1526, the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. Charles V sought every possible means to destroy the Reformation of Martin Luther, but he couldn't stop it. And so in the 1530s, you have the rise of a man by the name of Ignatius Loyola, and Loyola's intent was to destroy the Protestant Reformation of Luther and other reformers who started to rise throughout Europe. Well, by 1540, the Jesuit order was established. It was established for two basic reasons, very simply. It was established, number one, to destroy everything that the Protestant Reformation stood for. And the other thing is that as it would destroy the Protestant Reformation, it would reestablish the authority and power of the Roman Catholic Church. In that light, it's so critical that we understand everything that the Protestant Reformation stood for. Most people who still understand the Protestant Reformation think it was simply a religious movement. Well, of course, it was a powerful religious movement, but it infiltrated, it filtered into every aspect of human life. It had power and authority in government, because prior to the Reformation, there had been no such thing as republican government. It had all been monarchical, where you have a person dominating the populace. But the Protestant Reformation brought in the idea and the principle that there could be republican, representative government. In the economic realm, through the Dark Ages, when the papacy ruled, you had the wealthy class, you had the very, very rich, you had the very, very poor. Well, the Protestant Reformation brought in the concept of a middle class, that people could earn a living, and based on their talents and their skills and their hard work, they could make their own money. So the Protestant Reformation brought in representative government, it brought in a middle class, and then of course in the religious arena it brought in the fact that people could worship God not as their pope or their priest told them to do, right, but they could go to God through Jesus Christ and not have to go through any man.
So, no middleman.
No middleman, Steve, that's exactly right.
Right.
So these concepts, they came, and these are the fruits of the Protestant Reformation. And wherever you see those things, it's because of Protestantism. And wherever you see them under attack, you know that you see the footprints of the Jesuits. And just real quickly, Steve, without getting too far off, when you see what happened in the 1990s with Jesuit-trained President Bill Clinton, who went to Georgetown University, when he passed the North American Free Trade Agreement called NAFTA, which sent just thousands and thousands of middle-class jobs out of the United States of America and sent them to third world countries. Steve, you can see the footprints of the Jesuits all over that document to destroy the middle class in the United States of America, so that two classes could be developed in this country.
An attempt to get us back to the Dark Ages, back to where you have, as you're saying, the wealthy, the poor, but on top of both groups, you have the papacy.
Absolutely, Steve.
The papacy being the man who is God. And these are several papal statements. These are bulls that are, I'm not sure if they're bulls, but there are statements being made throughout history that the Pope is Jesus Christ on this planet.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a host of Catholic documents where the Pope takes the name of God, Lord God. He claims to be the vicar of Christ. On his tiara throughout history, it has always read Vicarius Filii Dei, which means I am the agent of God. I am God on this earth. So that's where all of this is heading, Steve. All of this New World Order, we're heading rapidly as we see the destruction of the middle class, as we see the destruction of Republican government, where we see more and more power being taken by the federal government. We see that in America as you and I are speaking. Just in the very last several weeks, we have the passage of that health care bill, which takes tremendous power and puts it into the hands of a few people in Washington, D.C., which completely decimates republicanism, where the power rests with the people. So we see these great strides being made, not just in America, but around the world, to have power put in the hands of a few and the destruction of the middle class. So we see the power of the Jesuit order working to reestablish papal authority and supremacy in this earth.
And so, Bill, do you see this as a fulfillment of what the Holy Alliance was trying to achieve back in the 1800s, the early 1800s?
There's no question, Steve, because the Holy Alliance was established at the Congress of Vienna right around 1814, 1815, under the Austrian ruler named Clemens von Metternich. Von Metternich, along with the Pope at that time, I believe it was Pius VII, and a host of European powers got together in Vienna. They then subsequently met 8 years later at Verona, and then there was a secret meeting in Cherie in 1825. And Steve, the whole goal of those three congresses, of those three meetings, were to destroy representative government throughout the world. And so we find in our world today, in fulfillment of those three congresses, the taking out of the people's hands authority in their countries and it being settled in the hands of just a few people. And again, we saw that with the health care bill just recently in America. That health care bill takes tremendous power out of the hands of people and puts it at Washington, D.C. So this is in fulfillment of those three congresses. And you know, another aspect of it, Steve, that's so critical for our understanding of what is happening in America today in light of those congresses is that in 1814 and 1815, according to Burke McCarty's book, The Suppressed Truth About the Assassination of Lincoln, another book that I have here, written by a man by the name of Richard Thompson, who was an American Secretary of the Navy. He wrote the book called The Footprints of the Jesuits, and he nails down that at the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815, the Jesuit order was determined to be that group of men that would seek to destroy representative government in the world. And the primary focus, the bullseye, if you will, of the Congress of Vienna was a rising power across the shores of the Atlantic called the United States of America. So the Jesuit order would be sent here to the United States disguised as painters, as lawyers, as artisans, as printers, and it would be their determined purpose to destroy representative government in the United States. It was such a dire threat to the United States that James Monroe in 1823 came out with his famous Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was simply a statement to the powers that were in the Holy Alliance: don't come and colonize in the Western Hemisphere. If you do, America will view that as an act of war, and we will go to war with you. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to James Monroe in which he said that this is the greatest threat to America since the Revolution. So the men that lived during that time understood how critical these congresses were and what a threat they were to the United States of America. The fact that we as Americans have been so asleep and in such a stupor and allowed this to happen, because we're seeing the fruits of those meetings today through the health care bill, through executive orders that are being passed that take authority out of the hands of the people and put it in the hands of just a very small few in Washington, D.C. John Adams wrote this to Thomas Jefferson. He said this about the Jesuit order. He said, "Shall we not have regular swarms of them here, in as many disguises as only a king of the gypsies can assume, dressed as painters, publishers, writers, and schoolmasters? If ever there was a body of men who merited eternal damnation on earth and in hell, it is this society of Loyolas." Steve, the Founding Fathers, for all of their limitations, they were men, they made mistakes, but they understood history. They understood that from the time of the inception of the Jesuit order in 1540 till the time of their suppression by Pope Clement XIV in 1773, that the Jesuit order had used intrigue, insurrection, and assassination to take over nations. Steve, the Founding Fathers of the United States understood that. That was why Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe and John Adams were so deeply concerned, number one, about the reestablishment of the Jesuit order in 1814, but even more so, the Congress at Vienna, Verona, and Cherie, because these leaders in the United States understood that the Jesuit order had been earmarked to be that group of men that would destroy Republican government in the United States and to seek to reestablish papal domination in our country. They understood that, Steve. That's why the Monroe Doctrine was written. That's why John Adams made the statement he did. And that, Steve, is why Samuel B. Morse, the famous inventor of the Morse code, wrote his two famous books, one published in 1835 called Imminent Danger to the Free Institutions of the United States Through Foreign Immigration, and his other classic book that he had published in 1844 called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. These men, Steve, understood that the Jesuit order would do whatever it took. Based on history, they would do whatever it took to destroy representative government in the United States, to destroy the middle class in the United States, and to destroy and take over all of the churches in the United States. And we are living today in that time, and we're seeing the fruits of those Congresses and the effective workings of the Jesuit order in this country.
So what do you think about, let's contrast for a moment, the scene in the 1800s when presidents like Monroe and Jefferson and Adams are against the Holy Alliance, namely the Pope and the kings of Europe, trying to infiltrate and control this country, destroy representative government. And today, when you've got presidents like George Bush, former President George Bush, and Obama and these others racing to meet the Pope every time they can, and actually bowing down to him on occasion. We've got pictures of that.
What we have in the United States today is we have the, for the most simple, we have the ripe fig in the crystallizing of Jesuit takeover in this country. They take over, they produce their political leaders. George Bush was trained at Yale. He was a part of Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones is clearly connected to the man who started it in America, William Huntington Russell, had gone to Europe, had been in some Illuminati meetings in Germany, came over to America to start a chapter of Skull and Bones in America based on the Illuminati meetings he attended in Europe. And it's very, very clear that the man who created the Illuminati, Adam Weishaupt, was simply a Jesuit foot soldier. When he started the Illuminati in 1776, he was teaching at Ingolstadt University, a Jesuit university in a stronghold of Jesuitism in Germany called Bavaria. And the principles of the Illuminati are the principles of the Jesuit order. So you have the Jesuit order, you have the Illuminati, then you have Skull and Bones. And so the Jesuit order, through Skull and Bones, has crystallized their plan to train political leaders in this nation. George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., both members of Skull and Bones, take the Jesuit agenda into the White House. And what is the result of that? What did you have? You have 9/11. And George Bush coming out after 9/11 with the New Patriot Act, which was actually penned by a Vietnamese refugee who has now come to America, he was trained at Georgetown, which is the preeminent Jesuit university in America, pins the New Patriot Act, which literally decimates our freedoms. So that now people will call me on the phone, Steve, and they'll say, "Did you write those books about those jays?" And I'll say, "Jays? I didn't write any books about birds. I wrote books about the Jesuits. Is that what you mean?" Steve, people are afraid.
Right.
Because our liberties, our privacy, it's been taken over.
It's been gutted.
It's been gutted.
By this Patriot Act.
That's right. And so here is a man, George Bush, Jesuit trained, vows that he will obey the Pope and the Black Pope when he takes his initiation rites with the Skull and Bones at Yale, passing the New Patriot Act, which destroys your freedom and my freedom. Prior to September 11th, George Bush dedicates a cultural center to John Paul in Washington, D.C., on the very soil where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by Jesuits in 1865. But here, at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st, now we have American presidents. George Bush, at the dedication of the Cultural Center, he says, the greatest thing we can do to show our respect for John Paul is to bring his teachings into action here in the United States. So, Steve, we see this complete change from men back in the 19th century who understood the evils of Rome, to whereas today you have George Bush with Skull and Bones giving his life to the Jesuit order. You have Bill Clinton, who was trained at Georgetown University. You have Barack Obama, who it's very, very clear has one Jesuit-trained member on his staff after another. The only one that comes to mind right off is Leon Panetta, who is the head of the CIA, who was trained at Santa Clara University, which is a Jesuit university on the West Coast. So Barack Obama is surrounded by Jesuit-trained men.
And his vice president is a Roman Catholic.
Joe Biden.
Joe Biden.
A devout Roman Catholic.
The head of the House is Nancy Pelosi, Roman Catholic.
Absolutely. In fact, when Nancy Pelosi was brought in as the Speaker of the House, she brought onto the floor of the Congress her Jesuit mentor, Stephen Privet, to address the Congress of the United States. The first time in American history that a Jesuit priest had addressed the Congress of the United States.
So the group vowed to destroy us are brought in, which may be indicating that they don't need to destroy us now, they've taken us over.
Absolutely. And Steve, the thing that's so very diabolical about this is that the Jesuit order controls both sides of the House of Representatives. I remember in the recent health care bill, as they were considering the passage of that bill, you have Nancy Pelosi, Jesuit trained, has a Jesuit mentor, and she's pushing for the passage of the health care bill. The man who was opposing it, which was the House Minority Leader, his name is John Bonner. John Bonner was trained at the Jesuit University. He's Jesuit trained. So they control both sides of the spectrum. Right. And we see that happening. This is the crystallization of Jesuit power and intrigue in the United States. It's controlling both political parties, whether it be Democrat or Republican, controlling both sides of an issue so that they can gain their synthesis. And that's what's happening today. And it all, Steve, is the fruits of and the byproduct of the Congress of Vienna, Verona, and Cherie. And instead of our political leaders today warring against it, as Jefferson and Monroe and Adams did, now we have American politicians who are slaves to the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order.
And I guess a lot of people are wondering why others in the Protestant arena aren't speaking out. The Billy Grahams, the Robert Schulers. Why are they not speaking out, in your opinion?
Steve, it's very, very clear from a statement that a trained Jesuit priest who escaped from the Jesuit order made his way here to the United States. While he was under oath as a Jesuit in his training, he was told something. The man's name was Alberto Rivera. In a little magazine, it's called The Godfathers, put out by Chick Publications. Alberto Rivera made a startling statement in which he said there would be a sign given to Jesuits throughout the world when all churches would be taken over by the Jesuit order. This was, and I'll read the statement to you.
Okay.
It says this, Alberto Rivera, the sign was to be when a president of the United States took his oath of office facing an obelisk. For the first time in U.S. history, the swearing-in ceremonies were moved to the west front of the Capitol, and President Reagan faced the Washington Monument. This happened January 20th, 1981. Steve, the Jesuit order was raised up to destroy everything that Protestantism had done, to destroy representative government, to destroy the middle class, but also, Steve, to destroy the voice of protest throughout Protestant churches. We're not protesting anymore, Steve.
Right, there's silence.
Billy Graham is not, he didn't protest towards the latter part of his life. For the first part, I think he was solid when he first started. But along around the early 60s, his voice was silenced. Robert Schuller, Paul Crouch, Hal Lindsey, Pat Robertson, James Dobson, all of these men, they're not protesting. What they have become are agents of Rome. And what we have developing in our country right now, Rome again controlling both sides of the pendulum. As a German philosopher by the name of George Friedrich Hegel, when he identified the best way to create change and to get what you want to happen, it's called the Hegelian dialectic. And what you do is you control both sides of a situation, whether it be political parties or ideologies. but you control both sides so that you can create your synthesis. And today in the United States, the Jesuit order controls the very, very liberal, radical element that we find in the White House today, in Barack Obama, and the control that he is gaining daily in this country. But we also have the Tea Party movement, the religious right, the conservative element run by Dobson and Robertson, and some of your talk show hosts like Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly. The Jesuits control both sides of this, Steve, and it's their desire to create such chaos, and that's what we see in America today, such chaos, the radical and the ultra-conservative, and there will be a clash, and in the aftermath of that clash, Steve, they will get their synthesis. But that's where we're heading today, rapidly, in this country.